As per usual, big huge spoilers for both the original Pathologic and Pathologic do follow in the video. You have been warned. The story of the man in the snake coat is one that grips everyone who plays the original Pathologic. I don't want to imply that the other two characters are less interesting, they are not. But the Bachelor story contains the pure essence of Pathologic for many people, for a variety of reasons. He is the first character many people play as. He is the outsider looking into a strange and otherworldly society. He is the foppish, slightly eccentric but desperate, obsessed and intellectual doctor that engages people from start to finish. The poem I selected to lead this video, by Gerard Manley Hopkins, is all about how the world can seem unjust. How can cruel men prosper? How can we wither and die so young? Are such limitations right? Can I succeed just once in this life? The Bachelor is all about these ideas. Not only does he contain the pure essence of Pathologic, but he contains the pure essence of life's struggle. Where the Haruspex is driven by love, mostly, the Bachelor could be said to be driven by a classic coupling of ambition and fear. Death is his enemy, always his enemy. It is the greatest possible enemy of the mortal being, but it is the knowledge that one will die that gives life meaning. The Bachelor's story is, to me, a tragic one. His story is one that ends with a realization that his enemy is worthy of his respect, that perhaps, finally, he has met his match. I did my analysis of Artemy through his titles. This video will be a study of the Bachelor through his relationships. People have pointed out on the video of his character animation I uploaded that his movements encapsulate a certain aspect of his character. His arrogance, his know-it-all smirk, and raised eyebrow that all imply he's merely amused at your attempts to explain yourself. He speaks copious amounts of Latin, slipping it into conversation in an apparent attempt just to seem smarter, to give himself an advantage, any advantage. His clothes reflect this as well. Platform shoes to make himself taller, a fancy coat, a fancy bag. He's a man who is at his most comfortable in the lab, not in the field. What is it that he does in the lab? Well, he studies death, or more accurately, thanatology. Thanatology as a profession has existed conceptually at least since 1903, when Russian scientist Elie Mechnikov put forward the idea of the study of death as a scientific discipline. Mechnikov was himself a microbiologist, that might sound somewhat familiar, who reasoned that the experience of dying was not something the world had many resources on. Bedside manner was something humanity was lacking in. Death was something utterly mysterious. While it remains mysterious to us today, there are at least things about it we have a greater understanding of. But Mechnikov's idea of studying death didn't really take off until after World War II. It was his idea of gerontology, in fact, the study of aging, that stuck. Studying death, though, doesn't that seem impossible? Before Pathologic, I certainly didn't have any idea that there was a specific field devoted to studying death itself. What's interesting about thanatology is that it's multidisciplinary. It straddles arts and sciences to become something unifying. Because death isn't strictly scientific, of course. We've much longer had an artistic, a gut, an emotional reaction to death. There aren't many people cut out for devoting their lives to the study of death. Or at least, I certainly wouldn't want to dedicate my entire life to it. The Bachelor, however, is that kind of person. A lot of people refer to him as selfish, but there's a noble selflessness to him, at least at times. He might want to leave town when he hears that the plague is coming, realizing he'll get nothing from it. But when he really sees that there is no escape, he works himself to the bone to save those he cares about. Thanatology was really solidified when an American psychologist, Herman Feifel, published a book, The Meaning of Death, in 1959. Feifel examined ways in which death could be used as a tool, for example, to execute criminals, to murder, or to express self-destructive behavior. Death, like everything else in the human world, can be reduced to a tool for some purpose. Feifel also noticed how people who are dying have stress levels similar to those experienced by soldiers in active combat zones. Dying people see no escape from their plight, yet they want to escape, they want to get out. The Bachelor's primary objective is to limit this fear, to stop anyone from having to undergo that kind of trauma ever again. And that, I think we could argue, is a heroic objective. Approached from this angle, death is made into some kind of boogeyman, a spectre that we can control and slay. Is the bit in the marble nest, where Asperty asks Dankovsky, how many different words did I use after she's been chatting about death? Dankovsky has two responses. He can reply, 1 and they all meant the same thing, or 40-something and all of them meaningless. Death to him is a crystalline focus, a singular monolithic entity that can be broken with enough scientific pressure. To Dankovsky, death is symbolic of failure. Feifel, in fact, has something to say about this. If a patient came to you with a fear of death, what might that fear symbolize, he said in 1998. And an article analyzing Feifel's life continues, before long he suspected that something was missing in our paradigms about death, namely the future. What will we become? What will become of us? He reasoned that humans conceptualize the future and then feed back fantasies of that future to the present. Man seeks an entry to the future. So death is representative of the future in Feifel's eyes. Humans are indeed rigged up strangely. We're conscious of our past, our present, and our future, unlike other animals. We can think about and worry about the future. What if this happens? What if that happens? A big part of human psychology is finding the sweet spot where security and freedom lies, which causes no end of consternation and worried thoughts for many of us. One of the most interesting observations that Feifel made, this time in 1965, was that physicians had a larger fear of death than non-physicians. He speculated that some physicians sought medical careers to help curb their own unrecognized death anxiety, which, could explain why Dankovsky went into the field he did. The very idea of wanting to defeat death. How hubristic, how callous, how insane, especially if you're doing it for the wrong reasons. Wanting yourself to live forever is the wrong reason. Seeing yourself as living forever, sitting atop a throne of money, well, that's not the future Dankovsky sees. Dankovsky sees himself as a liberator in some sense, death as the oppressor of all humankind, and he does what he does, or so it seems, to better humanity as a whole. Dankovsky does, however, side with a particularly authoritarian bunch, the Canes, but we'll talk about them later. We, of course, cannot forget one of the most haunting fictional writings on death, the death of Ivan Ilyich. I read it some years ago when I was a bit younger, before I went to sleep. I don't know why exactly, but I couldn't get to sleep after I read it. Tolstoy's short story contains such pathos that I do not think there is a singular story that is quite like it, at least not one I've read that's had quite the same impact on me. If you've not read the story, it details Ivan's life, describing how his relative good fortune turned to grim news after just one tiny stroke of bad luck. I hardly want to spoil the amazing language and the experience of reading it for the first time, but the basic idea is that Ivan was a regular man with a good job who tried to do his best, meaning sometimes he was great, sometimes he was terrible. He suffers in agony for what seems like no reason, but twists death into his enemy. Death, the thing which he sees around all corners, becomes a reason to despise his family. Why is it that he suffers? Why not them? But in his final moments, Ilyich looks at his son and his wife and pities them both for the way in which his death has trapped them. He hopes that his death will free them. With that last selfless act, Ivan's fear of death fades away, and, Tolstoy alludes, so does death. Well, to those of you who have played the Marble Nest, you might be thinking, oh, that rings a bell. It sounds a bit like an ending to the Marble Nest. I hope you agree that it does. As you surely must be aware, Pathologic is steeped in Russian literary traditions, and of course this is one of them. It is an extraordinary novella and one well worth reading. But there's a lesson here for Dankovsky, a way in which we can connect these two stories. The truth of death, Tolstoy argues, as does Iceberg Lodge, is something that can only be experienced when we are detached from that fear which Feifel found in many, many people. What that truth is, we cannot be sure exactly. Tolstoy argues it vanishes. Iceberg Lodge seemed to say it transforms into something new and unknowable. You have to play by different rules to beat death in the Marble Nest. The moment the truth is revealed in the original game to Dankovsky, I was floored. It was my first playthrough, I was invited to meet the powers that be, and I was floored. My struggle against death meant nothing. It would take a whole new playthrough to get the theatre meeting and learn something new again. There are two further books I wanted to talk about, both fairly recent. Death and Immortality by Alex Long, and Death Matters, Cultural Sociology of Mortal Life by Tora Holmberg, Annika Johnson, and Frederick Palm, because both of these books bring up issues key to the Bachelor's own thoughts and struggles. Death Matters in Chapter 4, Death, Doubts and Skepticism, discusses ancient cultural thoughts of death. In Chapter 7, Suicide, Religion and the City, the authors discuss what it means to contemplate death as it rotates around the self. The Marble Nest is all about the struggle because you have to choose whether it is time to give up living or not. Self-evaluation and thinking about our own interests and prospects, how well is my life going, will almost inevitably make reference to relationships with other people and, if we believe in them, with the gods. Nearly always we hope these thoughts will be reassuring, but a sufficiently severe crisis in interpersonal relations, or the prospect of one, may make suicide seem attractive. Dankovsky's struggle in that story is all about whether he sees value in going on or not. The reason I have kept his face as my avatar for so long is because of the Marble Nest's ultimate message, brought through by The Bachelor: you can keep living. Yet it is interpersonal relationships and death that make The Bachelor's story so heart-wrenching, especially in the case of Eva Yan, as I will discuss at length later on. The reason that Dankovsky keeps fighting in all of his in-game incarnations is related to this quote. Secondly, the interests of other people and obligations to them, or again for believers to the gods, may provide someone with reasons against suicide, or even in rare circumstances for it. We would probably think most immediately of those who need our care, such as children and elderly parents. People need Dankovsky. Or rather, at the very least, Dankovsky thinks people need him. And it's enough. He's too damn stubborn to quit. He's a fighter right till the end. Perhaps Dankovsky would agree with the ancient Socrates quote, "An unexamined life is not worth living." He encourages these kinds of thoughts, encourages both himself and the player to look at his mental state, at what he has achieved, and weigh that against what he may achieve in the future. It's so easy to get bogged down in the middle of actually playing Pathologic, because it looks like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. But on examining oneself, we can find a reason to live on, to fight that one more day, because it is through human action that we can make a difference. But death matters here. As human beings, we can't escape it, no matter how hard we try. In the end, our lives always come down to that one thing. The Bachelor is obsessed with beating that supposedly final event in our lives. If something exists, it therefore means there is a tool humankind can use to solve it. That's what science is for, right? Cautionary sci-fi stories be damned. The polyhedron is an interesting mix of material immortality and spiritual immortality. Material immortality, like building something and dedicating it to yourself or someone that you love, enables the person to have a sort of presence still on this world. Spiritual immortality is just that, the traditional idea that our soul can live on. What is even stranger is that in the world of Pathologic, the two are so tightly interconnected that material immortality can allow the spirit to manifest in the body of one that was particularly close to them. Victor lets Nina take over his body, for example, and Georgi lets Simon occupy his. And let's look at bacteria. Bacteria is bad, and you could even say gross, right? But we can also use bacteria to develop antibiotics. As Long points out in Death Matters, there's a natural tension between the life-giving, healing potential of bacteria and the disease-ridden side of it that creates in us this ambiguity about its state. Is it a friend or is it an enemy? This informs the way we discuss death. The fear that one day our antibiotics might not work and we will be sent back to the times when a simple infected cut could be all it takes to die. Long says antibiotic resistance is depicted as a road back to the Dark Ages, as an impending apocalypse in which bacteria retaliate against the human urge to control nature. Guess what the main theme of the Bachelor story is? Controlling nature. Or at least fundamentally changing nature. Another form of control, really. Think about the town. Or any town, really. Think of how the very existence of that town allows for its own little ecosystems. Birds living in trees on the main street or scavenging from the front of local fast food joints. Little creatures scuttling to and fro in the bushes and local pets thriving under the attention of loving owners. In a more than human world, killing becomes difficult to confine to a single unwanted organism or species. Not only killing, but also the entire life-death binary is based on the notion of the individual human subject. This binary is insufficient if we wish to understand the non-death of the Homo microbus. We live in a more than human world. On our bodies, it is not just us we have to be concerned about. The Bachelor studies blood to find out what microbes lurk inside our bodies, but also uses the microbes contained inside a dead body, specifically a dead heart, to see what makes the sand plague tick and decay. The Bachelor is very much concerned with bacteria and microbial death, and it is within these ideas of microbial death that thoughts of humanity as living symbiotically in a town emerge. But for the Bachelor, the death of the town does not mean the death of the human being. No, the people can live on without the town. In essence, the microbes can shed the body. Finally, I wanted to pick up on one more idea from Death Matters. A really interesting book, by the way, if you're interested in sociological or anthropological studies about death. What does it actually mean if something dies? And that's an important question, right? Long problematizes ideas of death by talking about towns and rural areas, using Sweden as an example. A huge drop-off in rural Swedish population, from 10% of Sweden's population in urban areas in 1800 to 85% in 2015, has triggered multiple campaigns to keep people rural. The most interesting part? All of the campaigns talk about keeping rural Sweden alive. So what does it mean for a place or a region to actually be alive? In Pathologic, the answer is obvious. The town is actually a living, breathing thing, or at least the thing it sits on top of is. It is Mother Bodo, the earth, and that is basically indisputable. The polyhedron is a spike driven towards her heart. We have ways to make people materially immortal, the cathedral, the graveyard, so on, but immortality itself eludes the people of the town for the most part. People die. So do places. The Bachelor dooms the town to a mortar shell death in his playthrough with his ending. Long talks about his visit to a dead peat factory, and we get some profound imagery. The site lay silent, but for the continuous buzzing of flies and gnats, as I began walking along the overgrown path, looking at and photographing different objects and structures. The decaying wooden structures, the rusty wheelbases and pieces of machinery, and the scarred mire all appeared before me as something that once was, but was on the brink of being no more. The immediate impression was that death, in its most material sense, was highly present in the remains of the old industrial structures. This impression was even stronger at some of the other sites. The farmhouses at Site K had moss and grass growing on them. The floors and ceilings had caved in. Also the iron-making sites, Celtic fields, and house foundations at Sites C, E, F, G, H, I, and L were barely identifiable, appearing only as discrete changes in the levels of the earth, with some stone formations or cairns giving hint of their former use. They gave the impression of death, decay, and burials, because all that remained of these places lied buried somewhere beneath the thick moss, peat, roots, and grass. Places die, not just people. The Bachelor's decision kills a place. He kills a history. Yes, the people live on, microbes shedding the body that had once served them well, and moving to a new one. But at the same time, the town ceases to exist. The place becomes, as Long describes, something that once was, but was on the brink of being no more. This is true both while you're playing the game, the town is dying of plague, and true after you've chosen the Bachelor's ending. All that stands is the twisted rubble of an entire, unique society. All that remains is the head, the brain. The Bachelor chooses to preserve the brain above the body. Fitting, for what does a man who is willing to make so many sacrifices need for a heart in the end? But there's a quote, right on the second page of Death Matters that says, "As is often the case, death reminds us of, and points to, life itself." The Bachelor's story is fundamentally one of missing the forest for the trees. Those around him suffer because he's fighting his enemy. Death, in the end, forces the Bachelor to live, to realize his own limitations. No matter what he chooses, the Bachelor comes to terms with his oldest and greatest enemy, either by beating it, or accepting that even he has limits. Death, perhaps, does not have to be the Bachelor's final stop. Thomas More's Utopia, published in 1516, is a somewhat difficult book to pass. It is layered with now antiquated English and contains ideas about what it means to live in a so-called perfect society. A utopia is indeed supposed to be just that, a perfect society. More was the first person to write of a utopia, and indeed the word comes from this book. It's difficult to say whether utopia is a wholly serious discussion or a satire, but either way, it remains the foundational point for our ideas about utopia and whether a perfect world can ever be realized. Chances are, no. Compromise is everywhere, and someone's perfect world is another person's hell. That's why empathy is so important. So thematically, it is the Bachelor's story that's most connected to ideas of utopia. The faction he belongs to are known as the Utopians, believers in a particularly perfect society. But their particularly perfect society is rigidly hierarchical, and notably intellectual. The Cains are the head of the Utopians and are the intellectual nobles, the branch of Pathologic society that has the power of the brain. Georgi is the judge instead of the boss of the meatworks or the town administrator. It is little surprise that the Bachelor is aligned with them. His realm is very much the brain, following through on more intellectual ideas. It is not just the fact that the Bachelor loves Latin phrases and can make condescending remarks that makes him an ideal fit for this faction. No, it is his relentless quest for knowledge, to shine a lantern to pierce the darkness, to end the fear, the tyranny of death. So the Bachelor is in charge of the brain. For contrast, Artemis is very much rooted in the body. His decisions come from the heart, whereas Clara makes more spiritual decisions from the soul. But the Bachelor is certainly the scientist, with Artemis again in the middle, and little to no grounding in science on the far end of the scale with Changeling. The Cains see themselves as inheritors of the earth, but it is not necessarily the Cains that the Bachelor idolizes, though he does make fast friends with them. No, the center of the Bachelor's story is, of course, the polyhedron. The polyhedron is the hinge on which the story rests, in some ways quite literally. It is where the game's moral discussions center. Should the polyhedron be allowed to stand? The Bachelor, of course, believes that it does because it can preserve the human soul. Georgi states that Simon's soul still resides within the focus of the polyhedron. Taken with an in-game perspective in mind, the polyhedron is the last resort of childhood wonderment and imagination. For the children, it is the last place they can imagine their beloved grandfather alive. When it falls, they can move on from their game. If it doesn't fall, they can create a world of fantasy where their loved one survives. For the Bachelor, the prospect of surviving death is not just a means of altruism, it is a means to save himself from the hands of the powers that be, who threaten to eradicate his entire life's work. It is a mission of survival, lest everything he has tried to achieve be utterly discredited. So is the polyhedron that is central to the Bachelor's story, and central in a way that asks us, what if you could preserve human life beyond death? Death, death, death. That is what the Bachelor always cycles back around to. Is a world without death, a world without limits, a utopia for the Bachelor? I think we could argue that mostly it is, because the Bachelor is a proud man and he's always been upset by these fundamental limitations in his life. The natural restrictions imposed on him seem unfair, unjust and immoral. Why should human beings not aspire for something greater? Think of the marble nest. The arguably best ending requires Dankovsky not to die, but also not to refuse to die either. He discovers that to beat death you have to think outside the box. There are other ways to go on. He breaks a natural limitation. Utopianism in Pathologic's framework is a model based almost entirely on the future, and a place of limitless experimentation on human beings themselves, whether it be mind, body or soul, with no small amount of Cain authoritarianism in there. But the Bachelor does not see the potential maliciousness of a Maria Caina as mistress queen of the town as a bad thing. The polyhedron itself is a vehicle of hope and imagination. It is a building built of itself, the simplest, most promising foundation, one that enraptures children and challenges grown-ups to do better. It is a model of a potential future. Destroying it, the Bachelor would argue, would be to destroy our hopes and dreams. Indeed, in his ending in the original game, he sees no more value in the town any longer. The town has birthed its miracle. The town matters no longer, only the miracle child, and it is the one good thing that has emerged from the entire debacle. For myself, I think Artemis' ending is the most satisfying. Yes, human life would be simpler, and there's perhaps less to aspire to with the destruction of the polyhedron, but more to gain. Love, hope, freedom, and unity. While there might still be grief and suffering and death, we retain our human spirits at the end of it, our freedom. The Bachelor's ending for me is darker, for it shows the army's guns laying waste to the town, preserving the polyhedron above all else. Everyone is out of a home and are now utterly dedicated to the future. There is, simply, no turning back. While I personally disagree with the ending myself as the best, I hope you can see what the ending is trying to achieve thematically. That the way forwards is to be shepherded by the Canes, their throne the polyhedron, and death as no obstacle to them, and that there can be no return to the primal past of humanity. The time we spent running after bulls on the steppe, of squatting in the mud and bathing in the deep bloody waters of the river Gorkin, these are times that have passed us by. But in making such judgments, the Bachelor is excluding himself from a particular worldview and perhaps misunderstanding the virtues of that kind of existence. I'm not arguing that we should all run back and live in the fields and entirely abandon technology, but I just want to be clear that the acceptance of the polyhedron, of utopianism, comes with a fundamental rejection of all things natural. The Bachelor rejects primal emotions and relies almost entirely on the brain. I can't possibly begin to argue who is quote-unquote actually right in this game, because there's no truly objective answer. It's entirely dependent on each person who approaches the game to make up their own mind. That's what the utopian ending is all about too. You can relinquish your character's argument in favour of another's. In the end, it's not the Bachelor who really gets to make the call about whether the polyhedron lives or dies. It's not the posturing of the developers subtly pushing you towards a particular worldview. No, in the end, utopianism lives or dies with the player. How do you begin to understand a culture that is different from your own? It's an incredibly difficult process because it requires a sense of deep empathy, a willingness to incorporate and understand difference and change, and to be brave and not shy away from those different things. It even requires you to let go of your belief that your values are the one and only way to live your life, which is really difficult. And it's an utterly rewarding process though, understanding culture, history, and those who are different from you. Part of that has to come from self-acceptance and of understanding just who you are and where you come from yourself. It requires you to be vulnerable, to accept that you're not right all the time and that your default is not everyone else's default. Dankovsky is an interesting character because he doesn't really bother trying to understand the cultural significance of the town. His original playthrough was concerned with medical science and aristocracy. Barely anything of actual use is revealed about the steppe in the Bachelor's campaign. One of the first side quests the Bachelor can accept is to go to Aspeti's house, and after a muddled conversation with a large steppe man whom he does not understand, you can even decide to murder him for a reward from young Vlad. The Bachelor is a hostile, perhaps even if we're looking for a literary term, colonizing force. His ending is all about leveling the town and starting from a utopian foundation. The only part of town remaining would be the polyhedron. The people of the steppe are effectively erased from the earth if the Bachelor gets to make the final decision. And that's tricky. The Bachelor is a mess of contradictions, I think we can agree on that. He's noble, but in that nobility can also be arrogance and condescension. His frank attitude and honesty allows him to be manipulated by those he first meets, and to lose friends when perhaps he needs them most. His love for preserving life makes him single-minded, hard-working, and amazing in his pursuit of medicine, and sometimes generous with his time, and is oftentimes genuinely heroic, putting his life on the line for a great cause. But again, he can be condescending, pig-headed, or unwilling to see that others have different viewpoints or origins from himself. Over the course of the story, the Bachelor is always mostly interested in goings-on within the town. He at one point enlists the help of some butchers, but sends them into plague houses, to subsequently die horrible deaths. Aspeti loathes Dankovsky for a reason. He's a character who ultimately doesn't really care about the lives of the kin, and that makes him, frankly, a difficult character to like in the original game, especially from certain perspectives or during certain quest lines. Sure, he has his cute, we're more than friends pen pal letters in Artemis' original playthrough, but his relationship with the steppe is an utterly troubled beast. He sees them as beasts, or as subhuman, which does inform the player's perspective on them, before Artemy humanizes them a lot in his campaign, giving us a view at them from the insider's perspective rather than the outsider's. Dankovsky, however, is mostly just keen to take them at surface level, ball-killing brutes, and settle for the stereotype, taking their mysteries and their wisdom only when he needs it to advance his own interests. It is good to see that Pathologic 2 has seemingly advanced his characterization even just a little bit. He makes more of an effort, it seems, to learn the steppe language, and performs a few extra kindnesses here and there. In the Marble Nest, the Bachelor has the option to interact with the wedding of the steppe people, though of course he's quite shocked by what the wedding turns out to be. As the player, you can condemn the kin, or just mutely accept that it happened. A woman is dead, and it's over now. But what makes this interaction so interesting is that it is a member of the kin who is trying to subvert their own beliefs. The worm husband wishes to die, or at least be terribly injured, so that the wedding to the earth might not go ahead, and the woman he loves won't be sacrificed in the ritual. The Bachelor essentially can insert himself into the steppe ritual and interfere with it. Because the Bachelor lives by a code, right? He's bound by the Hippocratic Oath, and his own morals to try and save people if they are dying. He knows medical science, he can use medical science, but when his action of saving just dooms the life of another, there is this brutal calculus that you really do have to confront. Because it sucks, right, that when you save another life just goes in its place. This encounter confronts the Bachelor, because it is him inserting himself somewhere where he really doesn't need to be, and things arguably end up worse because of it. In fact, that Bachelor inserting himself somewhere he shouldn't be is basically his entire relationship with the kin. While the regular townsfolk are very accepting of their new celebrity doctor, it is the folk of the steppe and the disenfranchised within the town who don't trust Dankovsky. Dankovsky, in his own story, tries to uncover the secrets of the kin, but he's tackled and almost beaten to death when he tries this. This is for good reason too. Dankovsky is a true outsider, an outsider who doesn't really bother to truly understand the kin's culture, and for them, is symbolic of a civilizing force. I'd like to supply a reminder that the kin's suffering is the reason the game's events begin in the first place. The Olgimsky family has done their best to destroy an entire culture, to quote-unquote tame the kin, to shove them into overcrowded bunkhouses without bothering to understand them or their past. They're the overworked minority whose complaints are never listened to, and because of that ignorance they are routinely shut up in the termitary, the massive bunkhouse they're forced to live in, and it is in there that they die in their thousands. You don't have to look that far to see this is a theme that still maddeningly resonates in today's real world in factories all over the planet. In China, Bangladesh, India, places where exported suffering has come to the poor or disenfranchised. Two examples resonate strongly with the themes of the game in particular. You can relate the kin's suffering directly to that of the crushing fist of industrial labour and capitalism as a civilizing force. A Pakistan factory fire on September 11th, 2012, nearly 300 people burned to death in this fire at a garment factory in Pakistan's commercial capital of Karachi. According to investigations, emergency exits were blocked. On the same day, a fire at a shoe factory in Lahore city killed 25. Also, a Bangladesh garment factory blaze tore through the factory on the outskirts of Dhaka in late 2012, which killed 112 mostly women workers. Bangladeshi authorities blame saboteurs for setting alight stockpiles of cotton. Survivors said that factory managers prevented workers from fleeing the multi-story building when the fire alarm went off. I could go on with these examples, but depressingly we'd be here for hours. My point is that to the kin, the Bachelor is firmly an enemy. As Asperty says, or rather memorably, the prickly prick who will bury us all. The abattoir is built atop a ritual sacrifice pit. It was converted from a sacrificial pit into an industrial-sized slaughterhouse. The earth was not meant to take that blood. While it was not Dankovsky's fault, he's also incapable of understanding. Dankovsky, for all his efforts to get inside, has come too late and did not try hard enough. The town's noble politics prevented him from getting inside at first. They prevent him from ever knowing their true secrets. In associating himself with the nobles, and dealing with the politics and the non-kin townsfolk, Dankovsky aligns himself with them. This is both a clever way from the game designers to get the kin to seem particularly unknown in a player's first Bachelor playthrough, and a way to show that Dankovsky is not really capable of taking on these vastly different ideas of how the world works. Shabnak Adder. What nonsense. There are some mysteries that Dankovsky cannot know, that intellectual medical science just simply isn't good enough to deal with. That's okay. But his frustrations towards the kin might sometimes step out towards outright bigotry, and I can't believe that they would believe this in the first place, or I can't believe these people live like this. But a reminder that the kin are not living as they would like to live. These statements raise questions around his own character, around his own personal morals. We've already discussed how he's not really keen to return to the days where you couldn't buy a kick-ass snakeskin coat and some nice platform boots, and kick back with a big medical textbook and a nice comfy bed. He's a man of civilization and a man of the brain. His views simply are basically incompatible with the kin's. Whatever you think of that, it's a position we have to grapple with, making him a character that with pronounced flaws that are very worthy of talking about and continually discussing in future. There's a general perception in the fan community of Pathologic that Dankovsky is utterly self-obsessed. He goes around letting people die and preserving only the architecture of the town he sees as necessary. I'd oppose that line of thinking as a be-all and end-all statement. Part of his story is that, of course, but Dankovsky's story is one of tragedy and subsequent growth, just like the other two stories. Just as Artemy loses his father and Changeling her adoptive parents, Dankovsky also loses someone, the woman who took him in and sheltered him, Eva. And it is that loss that so characterizes his entire campaign in the original game. The first half of his campaign is a quest for meaning, the understanding that you are the only person who can save the town. But like so many parts of Pathologic, it is a rug pulled cruelly out from under your feet. And since the Bachelor is likely the first character you'd play, this is probably the cruelest twist of the knife yet. But to add the greatest insult to injury, Eva's death cannot be avoided. It wasn't because you weren't playing well enough in previous days. It wasn't because she fell ill. She died because she thought it was the right thing to do. Eva is, tragically, given this illusion of agency that few other characters in this game are truly afforded. Eva's sacrifice is depressing and senseless. It seems to accomplish nothing, at least until the end of the game, where the Bachelor can talk to Eva at the top of the cathedral. So at least she inhabited the place as a spirit. It seemed to have worked. The Bachelor's most troubling trait in the original game is his dismissive nature. He's quick to deny anyone else's ideas a chance to take root and flourish. His way, the cultured way, is the way forward. As I've already discussed in the previous section, he has a troubled relationship with cultures he sees as more primitive. Speaking strictly again, let's bring up this idea of him as a colonizer figure. He supports the noble intellectual family and supports the building that will result in the prolonged and agonizing death of the culture of the steppe, willing to let the town be flattened for the sake of a mysterious tower. Dankovsky, in the classic game at least, is also a bit of an arrogant snob when it comes to the opinions of others. Let's go back to death for a minute. After Pfeiffel's book, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published her popular book on death and dying in 1969. It was her that created the 5 stages of grief that is so famous today. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It is boring and trite to say, but well-performed fictional death like the death of Eva Yan in The Bachelor's Route perfectly models this. The quest to save Eva was one that perfectly simulated those things. Because Pathologic lets you get close to Eva, lets you rely on her space as your home base. I didn't even realize I could sleep at other people's houses until after Eva died in my first playthrough. I couldn't bring myself to sleep at her house, so I tried to crash somewhere else and succeeded. But the place that had felt safe felt empty without her. I first experienced denial when I returned home early in the morning. I normally did a customary stop-in to say hi, to see what her dialogue that day was or if she had a side quest for me. Yet she was not there. Okay, I thought, and then checked my letters. My heart dropped when I realized she was gone. I played through the events of about half the day, trying to find her alive, but all the trails dried up. The Bachelor had failed to defeat death. I embodied denial, reloading from the start of the day previous and trying some different things to keep her alive. Nothing worked. Anger came then. Anger at the people of this wretched town that they could allow something like this. The magic of Pathologic's story is that it allows you to fully inhabit a character, and constructs the narrative in a way that fitting into their shoes is completely seamless. It does this by giving you a huge variety of conversations to engage in, and giving you quests that actually make sense for the character, slowly moulding and guiding you to engage in the character's beliefs, and the beliefs of those giving you the quests. So yes, I got a bit angry in-game. That anger transitioned smoothly into the Bachelor's goals. As the last days wore on, I bargained and was depressed, trying to find meaning, a reason to go on in a virtual world in which I'd already failed, where the first person that was nice to me, the first person in the game that meant anything to me, the person around whom I had anchored myself in this fragile, dying world was herself gone. A meaningful friend, dead for no reason. Meaning then instead came through the polyhedron. This I fully understood, the timing of the revelation aligning with the depressed haze in the wake of Eva's death. I threw myself wholeheartedly into beating my enemies, to helping the Canes defeat death. In the end, I accepted what I had to do. Then I met Eva again in the cathedral. It was like opening fresh wounds. Her sacrifice had meant something. I'm not sure if it meant anything good or anything truly meaningful, but what she had tried to do had been real. Her ghost lived on in the building, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that what the Canes claimed the polyhedron could do was real, that I had worked towards something positive, that my upcoming decision would be the right one. Pathologic validates your decisions through this interweaving of gameplay and story, allowing you to inhabit the big platform shoes of the Bachelor by giving you missions that place you further in his mindset. The character you become naturally closest to simply by virtue of where you start and the places you need to check for new missions. The fact that the Stillwater, Ava's mansion, is so close to the Canes where you will get most of your missions and where you have your equipment, makes the Stillwater a natural home base. This connection reinforces the connection that the Bachelor has to Eva, and the distress and grief he feels at her passing, reflecting those feelings right back to you, the player. Bachelor Daniil Dankovsky is, at the end of his story, exhausted. It is no wonder why either. Look at him at the end of Pathologic 2. He is a profoundly broken man who has destroyed Artemis' only chance of winning, or so he thinks anyway. But he kills a man to do it. He crosses an ideological line. For him, the polyhedron is personal salvation. But Dankovsky's wish for the polyhedron to live isn't really just personal salvation, is it? It's the hope he has for every one of the young children in town who he barters with, talks to, calls Pumpkin. It's the hope he has for the suicidal Peter Stomatin, the memory of Eva Yan, the belief of a better life for everyone who has ever suffered or lost anyone to death or is still hurting from grief. The Bachelor is not always heroic. In many ways, he is troubled, as I've discussed. But he is, like all the characters in Pathologic, human. He makes mistakes. We make mistakes. Death is something that many of us are terrified of. His story is a story about pushing the limits of what is possible. Whether that be how many burglars you can kill in one night with the cheesy broken combat, or whether it be how many lives you can save with a miracle built by mad utopians, Pathologic is that story. Pathologic exists to tell a story about getting up one day after another and trying to make a difference. Speaking up, having a voice, fighting for the lives of others who can't stand up for themselves. Dankovsky grows along dual paths. A cynical man who sees no value in the existence of a town that encouraged Eva to commit suicide, and an optimistic man who wants to stop human suffering, to evolve human beings themselves. He destroys human livelihoods to save human lives, places human souls under the yoke of immortality to prevent the suffering of pain and death. Whether or not you agree with his motivations, you must conclude, after all of this, he is human. Hi everyone, I know it's been a long time since my last character analysis video, fairly large understatement there, but I'm hoping this one was good enough to justify the wait. I could have done a little bit more I think, but boy, this video was long enough already. If I ever scrape together enough additional thoughts to justify a whole new analysis video, and who knows, I might make another one on The Bachelor. I will. But I've also really been loving my time streaming and analysing live whenever I've had the opportunity, which admittedly also has not been very often recently. But it's some of the most fun I've had creating content thus far, and I hope it continues like that for me. I'd love to see more people joining in live on Twitch, whether that be asking questions, posing some analysis of your own, or just chilling out and coming along for the ride. It's always a relaxed experience. I'm never playing a game truly high octane, at least not so far. And there's, I'm not one of those. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not going to be one of those people who screams into their microphone. I'd like to avoid that. So yeah, it'd be great to see you there. And if you do enjoy these videos, I have a Patreon, in fact, that you can flick me a couple of bucks on. It would be much appreciated if you are in a position to do that. Links are in the description. So, just in general, thanks so much to everyone who has been watching and enjoying my videos and my streams. I'm really happy that I'm even able to do this with my spare time and create cool stuff and analyze games like this, and even better that there are people there to watch me do it, hopefully.